One of the people that my father thinks very highly of is this man, Shavaran Bakumaru Kulasinghe. He's written here, Ba, the 2004 edition. Senile like me needs a hair transplant, like me, even more so. Yesterday's man, but the finest I've met. Now, I'm going to read to you a very important, well, I don't know whether it's important, but it's gives you a bit of a picture of what my father was actually doing in the lab, except that this wasn't in the lab, this was in the Kandy hospital. Well, what is he doing? Doing this stuff in the Kandy hospital with his students. And it's a passage called Midnight Madness. I started reading it earlier, and I'm going to read a bit more. It's to do with calcium level. Now, I had to point out that my father's bosses in England were particularly interested in the calcium level. So it wasn't, as he is claiming, some sort of original idea. But the way he went about doing this research gives you a bit of an idea into the kind of stuff that he was doing. He writes, the pig is one of the few animals where the thyroid and the parathyroid glands have readily separable blood supplies. I decided to cannulate the thyroid artery. Now, cannulate means you put a tube into the artery. And the parathyroid veins after the calcium concentration, alter the calcium concentration of blood supplying the former and see what happened to the latter. This was surgery well beyond my technical ability. I called Ba. BS. Ba, I want you to operate on a pig. Ba. Why a pig? Is it sick? Have you become a vet? BS. No, but I have an idea. Ba. Okay. What about 11 o'clock? BS. No, I have to give a lecture at 11. Ba. What? At 11 p.m.? BS. Oh, p.m. Why p.m.? Ba. Why not? Ba had, and still has, a major problem with sleep. When the rest of the world thinks it's time to go to sleep, Ba is just getting warmed up for the day, so 11 p.m. it had to be. I was keen on getting the medical students involved, partly because I wanted them to see how exciting medical research was, or how crazy research workers could be. Besides, I needed physical help and asked for volunteers. There was no shortage. We needed some able-bodied men to hold down a 300-pound pig while it was being anesthetized and then hoisted up onto the operating table. The females were needed to make sure the pig would not suddenly wake up, to run between the pig and my laboratory assistants in the next room, carrying blood samples, and to make innumerable cups of coffee to keep us all awake. The lads arrived on their bikes. The girls were transported in Ba's ramshackle van, the boot of which had to be tied down with ropes. I explained to them my crazy idea and suggested that they could come up with an even crazier idea. These will all be checked out. I told them that we could hit the jackpot but were much more likely to find that it was a complete waste of time. That is what medical research, indeed any research, is all about. I beg to differ, but Pig 1 had an early demise since I was the anaesthetist. We carved up the 300 pounds of pork and stuffed it into every refrigerator, every available refrigerator, bars, mine, and that of our friends and even our enemies. Now, presumably, this is pig with anesthetic drug in its system. He didn't obviously worry about that. We were now on pig 2, this time with a real anaesthetist, Dr Talwata, borrowed from the Kandy hospital. I was demoted to surgical assistant, i.e. the guy who hangs on to retractors and does what he is told, and whose motto for survival should be not to reason why, but to hold and die. We started as usual at 11 p.m. Bar opened the neck and was fiddling, trying to find something which neither of us had a clue where it was. He finally gave me a clamp with a loop of thread round something. Hold this, Bar. Hold this. Bar went on, fiddling in a small hole down which I could not see. I doubt if he could either. Some half hour later, with sleep and boredom getting the better of me, the clamp was beginning to sag. Bar, can you please concentrate? This is very delicate surgery. I protested that I was, with clear evidence to the contrary. Half an hour later, Bar was still fiddling. Sleep got the better of me, and I slowly sank to the ground, taking the thyroid artery with me. I woke up to find Bar desperately trying to clamp something which was spurting blood at the bottom of a deep hole. Yeah. Not exactly good training for students, is it? Unhelpfully, I drew his attention to the technical problem. B.S. Bar, I think we have a technical problem. Bar, you think I don't know. B.S. I don't think you do. It is that we cannot lose another 300-pound pig. Our refrigerators are full, and there is no room for any more pork. Now, that's my father trying to make light, and he's trying to amuse his readers, who are his ex-students. I don't find it amusing at all, considering that my father was being paid to do this by the government of Sri Lanka. Ba is the most unflappable person on this planet. This was about to change. I saw his pupils dilate, the sweat was beginning to run, a slight but definite tremor was noticeable. I knew his adrenals appreciated the gravity of the situation. The animal was bleeding to death, with no blood for a transfusion, since pig blood was out of stock. I said a quick prayer that Ba would find what he was blindly searching for. It worked. He clamped something, and the bleeding stopped. My faith in God and Ba was restored. So now I'm just going to read what my father says about why the lab was destroyed. If indeed it was. Some months after I left the country, I returned to see how the lab was going. I had expected to see the bubbling lab continuing to bubble under whoever replaced me. What I saw shattered me to the extent that I could not even manipulate my camera, hence the poor quality of the photographs shown at the end of this piece. The lab was locked, with no sign of life, let alone bubbling activity. The windows were smashed, the worktops destroyed, there were papers strewn all over the floor. The rain had beaten in, resulting in an inch of water inside. The lab had been murdered. What had been destroyed was a beautiful research laboratory which had produced more research publications per unit time than any other laboratory in Ceylon. It was a place where students and international research workers from Los Angeles, London, Scotland, Chicago, Australia, the All India Institute of Medical Research, and other places had worked. Why? 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 Was the only thing that went through my confused brain. Sri Lanka had not paid for this lab. It had no right to vandalize it. What had gone was my home, my baby, created and brought up with such love and care, had been raped. Why, I ask again? I know not. Just madness in a mad country where many events defy a rational explanation. Foreign aid donors and expatriates who want to help that crazy country should take some notes. Isn't there something about casting pearls before swine? Yes. Well, maybe the people in Sri Lanka worked out a little bit more about what had been going on in the lab. Experiments on tea estate workers. Experiments on public patients. They even cannulated the jugular vein, the neck. This fella here, his name was Senewiratne. He was completely untrained, except by my father. He was doing the venipunctures, sticking needles in, taking blood. He even took the blood from the necks of children for my father to estimate the calcium concentration. Why? Because his bosses in England were interested in calcium metabolism. And this is the piece de resistance. My useless toy, he calls it, a spectrophotometer. Now this is, that is the key. That is a key bit of evidence regarding what the real agenda of the Morris Motor Company and Nuffield Foundation and Max Rosenheim were all about. This machine. A PIE, P-Y-E, spectrophotometer. A spectrophotometer. Now my father writes, my useless toy, because it was sent over for him to do the early fluoride studies and packed up in a few months, and he didn't know how to fix it up. But the sale of the machine had already gone ahead. Right? It was one of many bits of British technology that was sent to the lab, and it was not necessary and it was not helpful, but it did help the British collect data on the water supplies in Sri Lanka. It allowed the British to collect data on the water supplies, not just fluoride, but the entire mineral content of water supplies. And it allowed the British to do a little bit more surveillance than that. In fact, a lot more surveillance than that. This is the paper that explains the use of the spectrophotometer. It's to do with chemical analysis. It's also to do with the British selling their technology to the third world under the Colombo Plan. So it says here, fluoride was determined using the ion-specific electrode, brackets Orion. The sample 5 mils was diluted with an equal volume of total ionic strength buffer, brackets 57 mils of glacial acetic acid, 58 grams of sodium chloride, 4 grams of disodium cyclohexylene. Well, can't read that without my glasses. Disodium cyclohexylene dimethylotetraacetic acid made up to 1 liter with deionized water, and the pH adjusted to between 5 and 5.5 with a 5 molar sodium hydroxide. With 5 moles of sodium hydroxide. The diluted sample was continuously stirred using an electromagnetic stirrer, and the electrode potential was measured using an expanded scale pi pH meter, brackets model 290. The readings were taken after there was no change in the potential for 10 minutes. This was considerably facilitated by feeding the output of the pH meter into a Pi AR Series 2 recorder run at 60 seconds per centimeter. The samples of drinking water, this is a key point, the samples of drinking water were also analyzed for calcium and magnesium by atomic absorption spectrophotometry, and sodium and potassium by emission flame photometry using a Pi SP 90 atomic absorption spectrophotometer. Right, that's what the machine was all about. If you read what my father in this article says about the spectrophotometer, you get a bit of a picture. This is what he writes. Having just completed my MD thesis in Dame Sheila Sherlock's liver unit, an atomic absorption spectrophotometer was an essential item for my survival. Not a hope in hell. We have no money to buy a pipette. If you want your fancy gadgets, go back to where you came from, was the unhelpful advice from the professor of medicine. The Hope ship was fortunately visiting Colombo, and the Yanks were streaming in to show the natives how to remove an appendix. My father's being a bit sarcastic there. A few came my way and asked if I had any problems. I said I had 2. To give my filthy ward a coat of paint, and the other to get an atomic absorption spectrophotometer. They replied, "We will certainly help you to paint the ward, but that gadget you mentioned, we have not even heard the word. We are psychiatrists. In any case, what the hell do you want it for?" I said I was studying rickets and wanted to do serum and urinary calciums. Unimpressed, they said, how did they manage here all these years? There must be another way to do this. There sure was. A simple electrometric titration, which in fact gave as accurate a result. I finally got my toy, but it packed up a few weeks later. Now my father is not mentioning the fluoride at all, which is very interesting as to why he doesn't mention the fluoride. He mentions the rickets and calcium. Now again, rickets is vitamin D deficiency, so this is another example of my father doing research on malnutrition, but not doing anything to get rid of the root cause of the malnutrition, which is poverty. So he writes, I finally got my toy, but it packed up a few weeks later. With a technician some 10,000 kilometers away in England, my toy, an expensive one at that, lay on the table unused for the next 6 years and then retired to its resting place in a storeroom. Now, one of the things that my father makes it easier to investigate him and his laboratory is the fact that he's a inveterate name dropper. He drops names all the time. He omits particular names at particular times, such as him omitting the name of his secretary and lover, Joyce Archong. I'll read that paragraph. She's the person that I started off this documentary trying to talk to. And I'll read this paragraph because it leads to the University of California, Los Angeles, and the role of the Americans in the research that they were doing on the endurance of starving tea estate workers. My father writes on page 12, I had invited a senior medical laboratory technologist from London to give me a hand in training my lab assistants. He doesn't mention that it was his lover. Within a month, the language barrier notwithstanding, Sene was pouring. That's that guy that I mentioned earlier, showed a picture of the guy in shorts. Sene was pouring every bacteriological culture plate, McConkey agar, blood culture media, the lot, and then plating out the urines, doing blood cultures, sputum cultures, and looking for malaria parasites, amoebae, giardia, and TB bacilli. The visiting insputor, the visiting technologist, Joyce Archong in other words, a fellow of the Institute of Laboratory Technology in England, saw to it that Sene could do everything she could do in bacteriology and parasitology, biological warfare in other words. Sene's technical ability knew no bounds. He did all the venipunctures, including jugular vein punctures on kids, since we were looking into the problems of childhood rickets. He went on to do bone marrow aspirates in our studies on megaloblastic anemia. He even put in the peritoneal dialysis catheters in patients who were being dialyzed. Now, this is a man with no medical training whatsoever that my father took under his wing. Scientists from the famed UCLA in California came to work with us on health problems in plantation workers. Sene did all the field work for them. Professor Reggie Edgerton, who is still at UCLA, will testify to this. When these scientists were due to return to Sri Lanka a year later, they specifically asked if Sene could be assigned to them. So, my father ran the lab as if it was his own personal possession. He was the boss. And as he says, the boss in Sri Lanka can do anything. But the boss in Sri Lanka should not be allowed to do anything. The boss in Sri Lanka should not be allowed to do what my father did. And I have read this before in presenting evidence against my father, because this is a monstrous story. So I'm not going to read it again, but this is where my father admits, actually I might read it. It's about compassion. He writes, "Compassion is an extension of caring. Let me tell you a story of a little boy from the tea estates who died in my ward. It was the time when Prime Minister Sirima Bandaranaike's goons were storming the tea estates and driving out the tea estate workers who were dying on the streets of Kandy. Actually, what it was is during the time that the government was nationalizing the British tea estates. My father was, of course, on the side of Britain. So this is the key point. I used to do what I called my nocturnal ward round, when I went round the streets of Kandy to collect the human refuse, pile them into my car, and take them to my ward, where they could die with dignity, love, and care." This is where he tells the story about how he found a child in the middle of the night, diagnosed him with cholera, which is very unlikely that he would be able to make a diagnosis of cholera. In fact, he could not make a definite diagnosis of cholera in the middle of the night in the street in Kandy. He took this child to his adult female ward, put a drip into the child, and the child died a few hours later. No, that's manslaughter. And my father uses it to promote himself, as usual. There was another side of the lab about which things were not published. Things were not published. And this included research on rabies and research on other lethal viruses and bacteria. And because nothing was published on it, I don't have any proof about it apart from my own memories. And the person who does know about it, who is my father, is not going to talk about it. So I'm going to leave it there to my little documentary on Brown's lab.